Wait, we should wait till the Zoom is.
Yeah, I
Raise
think,
now,
all
there be 10.
right, we're recording, so I think we're ready.
All right, Ned Hall and Lewis and Quine and what's natural?
Awesome. Thank you for that generous introduction.
Anytime.
So when Barry asked me to like contribute to this conference on Lewis and Quine, I thought like, well, of course I have to say yes, because Barry's asking me. And I didn't want him to be sad. And then I thought, like, what the hell do I know about Quine? Anyways, I mean, I've read Quine, but I will be honest, like I usually with
At
annoyance.
Harvard, he was called the angel of Harvard.
Huh. Wow, that's kind of hard to reconcile with reality, but whatever. But partly because when I read Quine, I just tend to get annoyed. This is not a healthy reaction. I'm not recommending this reaction. I take this to mark some deficit in my character that I get annoyed. But the reason that is that I find myself often swimming upstream against a fairly strong current of a certain kind of rhetorical style that impedes my understanding. But it was a useful exercise because I thought well, what could I write about or talk about rather? Maybe something about natural properties that had the virtue that, as far as I can tell, there's really only one thing of Quine's that you really need to respond to, which is the paper Natural Kinds. And then it was a good exercise in okay, Ned, overcome your aversion to the rhetorical style and extract the argument. To explain where the aversion comes from, I think this is number one, some opening milder, snarkier remarks about Quine's and Lewis's rhetorical style. I think what you very often find in Quine, and I'm sorry to say this, but find too often, if not as often in Lewis, is places where very clever stylistic rhetoric substitutes for argument in a way that actually kind of makes it harder to see what's going on. There's a distinction that years ago, a graduate student of mine, Kranti Saran, drew my attention to, because we were arguing, as one does, about who's an awesome philosopher, who's the greatest philosopher, because this is very important to settle. And I was going on about how awesome Lewis was. Look, even if you think his views are crazy, at least he's clear. He's exceptionally clear. And I just took this as obvious. And Kranti responded, no, Ned, he's drinkable. He's not clear. So I thought that was exactly right. Exactly right. And that drinkable clarity, distinction is a really useful one. Pitching this, especially to graduate students in the audience, go absolutely try to develop a good prose style, but don't sacrifice clarity for drinkability.
He didn't continue to say you got drunk on him.
No, I wasn't that quick. I was I was too taken aback, oh crap. It was one of those Gestalt shifts where you realize all this time, I've been mistaking drinkability for clarity. We'll see that we've already seen this in some of the discussions yesterday. There's this very evocative Neurath's boat passage that Barry read out yesterday, where it's actually kind of hard to see what the philosophical thesis is there. When we say there's no transcendent perspective from which we can assess our methods for empirical investigation, or there's no Archimedean point. Well, what exactly is that supposed to be ruling out, and why would it rule out Lewis's methodology? Barry, you said yesterday you thought it did, that you saw Lewis's
not his methodology, but that is his. I was proposing that it ruled out his view.
Yeah, right. But that's at least not clear, right?
I was trying to get an argument for it.
Yeah, okay. And we'll come back to this because I'm going to try to be a little more clear and not just drinkable on this point as we go along. But I don't know whether I'll succeed. I think there is an interesting challenge to the way Lewis invokes natural properties that can be maybe heavily read into what Quine is doing in the paper Natural Kinds. I'm not that concerned whether I'm getting Quine exegesis right. I think there's a kind of way of thinking about what we're doing when we step back and philosophically critique our methods for evaluating empirical evidence and for doing science, that I think you can extract from Quine, or at least see is inspired by what he says there, which might form a basis for a kind of interesting critique of what Lewis is doing in invoking natural properties. But first I want to say some things, this is section 2, in defense of of Lewis's approach, and in particular, I mean, this is the part I'll probably lean most heavily on, in particular in defense of Lewis against the mismatch problem that Barry mentioned yesterday, and I'll try to say a bit more about how I understand what that problem is. I will say that, and I don't want to make a big deal of this, but when I read Lewis, I find that the drinkability clarity distinction comes in it for me at certain points in trying to understand what exactly it is about his view that makes it a metaphysical view. So like there's a really interesting passage from New Work, which I'll just read out. It's on the handout. Because properties are so abundant, they're undiscriminating. Any two things share infinitely many properties and fail to share infinitely many others. That is so whether the two things are perfect duplicates or utterly dissimilar. Thus, properties do nothing to capture facts of resemblance. That is work more suited to the sparse universals. Likewise, properties do nothing to capture the causal powers of things. Almost all properties are causally irrelevant, and there's nothing to make the relevant ones stand out from the crowd. I think there he's sort of slipping in some of his Humeanism about causation laws, by the way, in the background. Properties carve reality at the joints and everywhere else as well. That's a beautiful example, like clever Lewisian stylistic writing. If it's distinctions we want, too much structure is no better than none. No, and then he goes on. That last sentence, I think, deserves like scrutiny. Like, why is it that too much structures? What do you mean too much? Anyways, no, once you've got properties as classes, of course you have properties of properties. And so we have distinctions between properties. Like we don't want for distinctions between properties because, we have lots of them. Why is it a bad thing to have like so many available? We might just say like, look, some of the ones are the ones we particularly care about. But there's this picture behind the scenes that somehow reality itself has to provide the distinctions. And that picture, I've heard a lot in conversation about this. And so sometimes people will just quote or paraphrase this line, like, look, it's not enough to just have classes because then there's nothing out there that distinguishes some of them. Now, in some technical sense, that's wrong. They're, because they're classes of classes, there's plenty of stuff out there that distinguishes them, right? But the thought again is that, well, no, like reality itself has to limb certain of the properties and relations as special. This thought is like, very, very powerfully evoked at the beginning of Ted's book, for example. Am I right about that, Ted?
Yeah, well, I don't know, it's powerful.
So I honestly don't know whether this is just a deficit on my part or like my confusion here is because I'm latching onto some real problem. But I think there is like an interesting question here and in other areas of metaphysics. What makes a certain thesis a metaphysical thesis? And it's tempting in this case because of the popularity of grounding to go in for like grounding talk as a way like, well, look, we need to go beyond Lewis and say that something about like what grounds the distinction between certain properties, like that is, if we grant that we want some way of distinguishing properties that are of interest or worthy to be investigated and ones that aren't. Well, minimally, we understand that as a metaphysical thesis because we want to deny a certain grounding claim about that distinction, namely that the distinction between natural properties and other ones is grounded in, say, psychological facts about us, right? So you could say view the thesis as a metaphysical thesis insofar as it's denying a way of understanding the distinction that would demote it from a metaphysical distinction to something else. Does that sort of make sense, people? Okay. I guess I find that pushes the question back because now I want to understand well, we need to understand grounding itself as a metaphysical relation, not as an epistemic relation. And so I still want to hear more about how to understand that distinction. I think that there is not necessarily a way of like saying what it is for it to be a metaphysical thesis, but a consequence of that commitment, maybe that will be enough for our purposes. I hope so, which is a consequence that Ted brings out in his book, where he says at one point, I won't be able to quote it from memory, but the key idea is that once we understand that there's this kind of, as a matter of like fundamental metaphysical fact, like a structure to the world, a determinate structure, that imposes a kind of epistemic constraint on us beyond just getting the truth. That is, the constraint is you want true theories and true theories that whose descriptive vocabulary tracks the objective structure that there is. And that's like presented in the book as a strictly additional epistemic constraint on us as theorizers. And that might be enough for one to think like, okay, well then Lewis is in trouble because of the thing that Barry calls the mismatch problem. So what I want to do now is just say a little bit about how I understand what that problem is and how I think that from a Lewisian perspective, like Lewis has the materials to respond to it, although deploying those materials in the most obvious way will highlight consequences of the view that I think David has been, how do you pronounce your last name? I'm sorry. Yes. Willis, yeah, has been talking about. Okay. So in the way this was, I think in the literature, this may first have been put forward by von Frosten. Is that right, Barry? Okay. Where he says like, look, why should we think that our best scientific theories have that their core sort of primitive vocabulary tracks like the perfectly natural properties, like expresses or at least expresses something close to the perfectly natural properties. And you're invited to think of the following kind of skeptical scenario. You have a world in which scientists like do their best and they come up with an awesome physical theory that is comprehensive, passes every empirical test you could want, is elegant and simple. And yet you think, well, look, one possible world is a possible world in which the basic predicates of that theory do match onto perfectly natural properties. But surely we could imagine another possible world, just like swap in different perfectly natural properties at the appropriate sort of locations in reality and in some some random way, where the theorists are just as successful in their theoretical tasks. That is, their theories pass all the right empirical tests, et cetera. But the basic predicates fail to match up to anything perfectly natural. And then one's invited to think like, well, look, I guess there are really sort of two thoughts, just distinct thoughts here. One is that having noticed this possibility, you ought to be skeptical that our own practices will, even if everything goes as well as we could possibly hope for in terms of this, like passing the standard empirical tests, coming up with nice, elegant, unified theories, we should be skeptical that our own theories are going to latch onto the perfectly natural properties in our world. And there's maybe a different challenge, which is like, maybe you shouldn't care whether or not they do. Now, that second challenge I'm going to set aside for now. I just really want to focus on the first, like, skeptical challenge. Does that everybody understand what the skeptical challenge is supposed to be? Okay. One thing to notice though is that on Lewis's view, I think it's before directly responding to that challenge, it's just worth stepping back and noticing the pervasiveness of certain kinds of work that his invocation of perfectly natural properties does for him. So for example, I take it as given that on Lewis's view, any possible world has to have a fairly rich pattern of instantiation of perfectly natural properties. That is, what would be really weird would be, I mean, I'll qualify that in a minute. What I'm imagining is like, suppose you think there's a possible world, let's take the extreme on the other side, in which there are no perfectly natural properties instantiated or perfectly natural relations, right? On Lewis's view, that will be an undifferentiated goo, right? And so, for example, like I can just by sort of looking around me tell that I do not inhabit a world of undifferentiated goo. So I automatically know that I inhabit a world that has some perfectly natural properties instantiated within it. All right, so that's just an opening remark. I feel like I should pause there, partly because like Jonathan is looking very concerned. And I don't care, like I do not respect the talk Q&A distinction. So if you want to break in, go ahead.
What if there's just structure all the way down and things get ever more natural without that?
Yeah, that's an interesting possibility. I'm not sure that Lewis could accommodate it because of the way he understands what less than perfectly natural properties are.
They're defined in terms of the perfect natural properties, but that doesn't mean the perfect natural properties that they're defined in terms of how to instantiate.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. Yeah. Though, I'm not sure it would respond to the goo thing, because on his view, two things are perfect duplicates, just in case you can make a sort of appropriate mapping from the parts of one to the parts of the other that preserves instantiation of perfectly natural properties and perfectly natural relations. So he'd have to modify that part, and that was the assumption I was working with in the background, that perfect intrinsic duplication is defined that way. So if you've got two things such that there are no perfectly natural properties instantiated by any of the parts of one or any of the parts of the other, then by default, they're perfect duplicates. That's what I meant by saying there's undifferentiated goo. Like, the only distinctions between things would be distinctions at the level of just bare mereology.
He did want to make sense of the prospect of limitless descent.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you're right that there's parts of it.
Yeah, okay, so at any rate, we'd have to, this isn't gonna matter to the defense against this von Frosten problem, but we'd have to adjust there. Yeah, Isaac.
Sorry, so just to clarify, your point was that in these worlds, everything's a duplicate of everything.
Yeah. Well, up to mereological,
Yeah, yeah.
like part whole, identity of part whole structure.
So Ned, do you think that Lewis allows for there being worlds in which no properties are perfectly natural?
He might, but there.
I was
like,
proposing-
just one.
I was denying, I said, I'm proposing that that's not the case, though I didn't know any place where Lewis made it.
Yeah.
I mean, that would give a reduction of possible worlds to natural properties if he did.
Yeah, I mean.
Can I
in a way
pause
he
for one
does that.
second as
Yeah.
the chair?
Yeah.
You say you do not respect that the discussion presentation distinction. Do you mean that you
I don't
want to
wholly
have?
disrespect it.
Do you mean that you want to have clarification questions at the during and substantive questions at the end, or do you mean you want everything mushed in?
I don't respect the clarifying.
What do you, how do you feel about the chair or non-chairs? Maybe I need to withdraw, or maybe this is just power at this point. Maybe we just. Seriously, should we have the substantive stuff at the end or no?
No, we can have substance stuff in the middle. If it goes
Oh,
on too long,
okay.
I will just keep track. Just
I'll leave
so-
you in
just
charge.
With a, I mean, I would, just
I don't
for the
wanna-
record, Ted, whatever else, wherever else my disrespect extends, I respect you. So, okay, so, but back to the mismatch problem, the way I phrased it. So we're to imagine two possible worlds, in both of which the theorists do a fabulous job. In one of which the basic predicates of physical theory latch on to perfectly natural properties and relations, and the other which they don't, or at least they don't all. There's substantial mismatch, hence the name mismatch problem. I think it's just worth noting that from the way you would describe that second world through a Lewisian lens, I think to some extent undermines its skeptical force. That is, through a Lewisian lens, if I'm asked to, let's try to make it a little bit like concrete. Like, suppose that these are worlds of particles, and the physics is something like some kind of classical physics, just to fix ideas that posit certain perfectly natural properties, or really magnitudes that attach to the particles, to each particle. And in one world the physics gets it right, and in the other world it gets it wrong, but not in a way that makes any difference to its empirical success. I think there are a couple things to note. One is, I may not have succeeded in this case in really describing the skeptical possibility properly, because the second world, where physicists talk about, say, mass and charge, but there is no perfectly natural magnitude of mass, or family, if you like, of perfectly natural properties that are the mass properties, and there is no family of perfectly natural properties which are the charge properties. We've still got, at the level of perfect naturalness, some distinction between points of space-time as to whether they have a particle in them or not, or filled or not. So one thing you might think, this is the first of two strategies for responding to the mismatch problem, is that, look, the kind of skeptical scenario that we could plausibly worry about is something, not a skeptical scenario where the physics gets wrong the aspects of the microphysical ontology that are most directly relevant for determining macro level facts about the geometrical organization of things in space over time, right? That is, if you think like the job description of physics is to explain motion, or in general to explain change of configuration over time, starting with like big ungainly hunks of stuff. And physics will posit a kind of micro level structure that grounds that macro level geometrical structure, and along the way includes other features, right? So we're distinguishing here the posit that there are, say, point particles from the additional posit that those point particles are endowed with, values for some small set of perfectly natural magnitudes. Distinguish those two aspects of the theory. If all we have is a skeptical hypothesis according to which the theory gets the first part exactly right, it's story about like where particles are and the kinds of motions that are possible for them. But it gets the second part wrong in that it posits mass and charge and so on, but there are no such things. Again, describing it through a Lewisian lens, right? There are no such perfectly natural magnitudes. Well, that may not be such a big deal for a Lewisian, because maybe what a Lewisian should say is like, well, when I told you that you wanted to systematize a certain range of facts about the world, and you need a language for describing those facts whose predicates correspond to perfectly natural properties, really the language is a fragment of the language that a proper physics will introduce. It's that fragment of the language apt to describe physical, the kind of microphysical structure that grounds sort of the geometrical organization of matter over time. Like in our example, the canonical language has to have for a world of the kind I'm describing, a basic predicate may be filled versus unfilled, for points of space-time. But then that's all the canonical language needs. But of course, we're familiar from Lewis's treatment of chance that a candidate system can introduce other vocabulary, not because it's vocabulary needed to describe the sort of distribution of perfectly natural properties and relations in the world. Think of the vocabulary of chance. And we have a story to tell, which I won't go into now, but I'm hoping is familiar enough, about how that vocabulary gets its purchase on the world. It gets, like as a first pass, you introduce it into a candidate system in an uninterpreted way, but in a way that's uninterpreted, but still allows you to weigh the relative merits of different candidate systems. And then it gets its meaning from the way it shows up in the ideal, in the best system. Okay, so we've known for some time you could do this with quantities like mass and charge. You could do the same, like in a paper I wrote a long time ago, called this like the manufactured quantities approach. So that's one strategy for responding to the mismatch problem, to say, first, the mismatch problem, like these kinds of skeptical scenarios that we should take seriously are ones where the mismatch is kind of localized to that part of the descriptive vocabulary of fundamental physics that is not, directly tied to the perfectly natural properties and relations that ground facts about locations of things over time, or locations and shapes and motions over time. And second, the mismatch problem doesn't arise there because you, von Frosten, have misunderstood how a best system approach ought to handle the remaining part of the vocabulary. That's one thing you can say. Okay. There's a totally different substantially different strategy, though, I think. Let's say, no. I really want, at the end of the day, to, I would be sad if I couldn't think that mass itself is a genuinely perfectly natural magnitude, say, and likewise charge, and likewise whatever other, I'd be sad if I couldn't have the same attitude towards the other basic predicates of my physical theory. I don't want to view them as manufactured quantities in the way I was indicating before. Well, then you can step back and ask, like, how should we understand what the laws are, by Lewis's lights, what the laws are of a world, say, that is just like our well-behaved classical particle world, except that instead of where over here we have nice, like the physics gets right claims about the masses and charges of things, over here it gets them wrong, and there's some other perfectly natural property, or maybe there are no perfectly natural properties beyond mere locational properties. Well, a systematization, again, if we're sort of saying the systematization is not allowed to go the manufactured quantities route, a best system for the world over here is not going to be that good. No. Or at any rate, it's going to, most likely in typical cases, it will issue in laws that not only fail to be deterministic, but that fail to assign probabilities too. Or if you're really clever about how you distribute the perfectly natural properties over here, maybe you'll get deterministic laws, but they'll be very unlike the ones that the theoreticians in that world posit.
But best system, you're involving more scientific, more criteria than just informativeness and simplicity, right?
No, I was going by Lewis's.
Then I don't see what you say is right.
Okay.
I mean, because suppose you gluify all the
Mhm.
fundamental properties, you could then come up with a system which is just as informative as what we think of as the best system for the natural properties. And it could be just as simple in the gluified vocabulary.
Oh, I was taking for granted Lewis's approach, Barry, that the vocabulary of the best systems has to be a vocabulary whose basic predicates all pick up perfectly natural properties.
And the best as
I was taking for granted the bog standard Lewis approach. We write, candidate systems have to be written in a canonical language. The criterion for language being canonical is that its basic predicates all express perfectly natural properties.
maybe maybe it's for later, maybe just misunderstanding what the dialectic is over here. Another question, I was imagining somebody who said, what's so great about perfectly natural properties? The world, you could carve up the world in terms of these other properties.
Yeah.
And wonder about the best systems in terms of these other properties. That would be the skeptical challenge. What's so great about perfectly natural properties? Why are we doing it that way?
Well,
So
I think that's-
shall we just?
yeah.
I mean,
Why don't we come back to
he
this?
basically takes the
Why don't we
Shabbat
come back to
mismatch
this
volume and
because I want to get the response out on the table and then you
Okay,
can
okay.
see. I mean, it may not, at the end of the day, respond to the challenge the way you're thinking of it.
Mhm.
I was just thinking like, look, if we follow Lewis's account of laws, one might worry that we face a serious skeptical difficulty. Like, let's bracket for the moment what the best response is to that skeptical difficulty. You might just think like, look, like, what are our grounds for thinking that our predicates latch onto perfectly natural properties in Lewis's sense? So the point was this: if we think of a world in which we permuted things perfectly natural properties, or just swapped in other ones where we used to have mass and charge, we just have like some miscellaneous assortment of other perfectly natural properties, but the particles move in the same way, right? In exactly the same way. And we think like, well, isn't it, look, the people in that world, the physicists in that world are just getting things wrong because they're failing to meet this crucial epistemic constraint that Ted has alerted us to of writing a theory that not only says some true things, but that whose basic vocabulary latches onto the actual joints in nature. So there's a kind of epistemic failure. Well, by Lewis's own account of laws, we should step back and ask, like, what are the laws of that world? And, that will depend on the details about how you like swap in or remove other perfectly natural properties. But suppose you do it in a way that, again, if you look at candidate systems for this messed up world, written in a canonical language, right? Written in what Lewis takes to be a canonical language. The ones that do the best job of balancing simplicity and informativeness will still do a pretty crappy job. Right? So they won't be very informative. They certainly won't have deterministic dynamics. In fact, they probably won't even have probabilistic dynamics. They may have, they may say some fairly bland things about like their particles and they move, and that's sort of it, right? And now let's take seriously. Let's prescind from Lewis's view and just ask, like, when we came to our sort of the philosophical project of understanding what laws of nature are, what are the kinds of possibilities that we're willing to sort of take seriously in the sense like we think those are genuine possibilities, but maybe not take seriously in the sense that we don't think it's an urgent matter for epistemology of science to figure out why we don't have to believe in them. Well, there are lots of possibilities like that, right? Like when you learn physics, you learn, like one of the things you learn more or less implicitly is like, look, there are conceivable worlds where the physics is highly deceptive to denizens of that world as to what it is. Right? One is where, like, here's a world, there are no laws. Stuff just happens. Like, this is what, some people think Humeans are saying all along, right? Or here's another world, there are laws, but they place very loose constraints on what can happen. Or here's another kind of world, this is a maybe more interesting possibility. There are laws and they impose fairly dramatic constraints on what can happen given an initial condition, maybe even to like deterministic constraints, but the initial conditions are so cleverly designed that the phenomena available to theoreticians, like theorists, scientists in that world, will systematically mislead them as to what the laws are, right? Again, like an easy example to fix ideas would be like there are laws that are like fundamentally stochastic. Just full disclosure, I'm going to describe this possibility in a way that's unfriendly to a Humean. But I think in the dialectical situation, that's okay. Like there are laws that are fundamentally stochastic, but it just turns out that the stochastic processes unfold in a way that's highly, highly regular. And so scientists in that world are systematically misled into thinking that theirs is a deterministic world. Really the atoms can swerve at any moment, but they never deviate from nice Newtonian trajectories. That's something that, according to those laws, can happen. All right, so we should be used to the idea that there are ways the laws could be, which combined with certain initial conditions could be systematically misleading. Right? We shouldn't view that as a kind of threatening skeptical scenario. We should think that's part of the price of doing business as a sort of physicist. Like you understand enough about how the world works and you realize like, yeah, we had to get at least a little bit lucky that given the way the physics works, the phenomena unfolded in a way that made it possible for us as theoreticians to see that physics in the phenomena. Like, the physics discloses itself. And it's not given a priori that the physics will do that, right? We shouldn't want an a priori guarantee that the physics will do that. And once you've made this observation, you can go back to the mismatch problem and say, like, is that all we're being reminded of here? By Lewis's lights, a messed up world could be redescribed this way. It's a world with weird physics, but where things work out in such a way that the weirdness of the physics gets hidden from view of the people in that world. That I think is like a perfectly like coherent strategy for responding to the mismatch problem.
But you use a non-Humean account of chance in order to make that point.
Well, only that was just one example, right? But in general, I might think like, look, I don't want it to be I shouldn't expect it to be a constraint on my philosophical account of laws, that it deliver the result that whatever the laws are, the phenomena they issue in disclose what those laws are.
Of course not.
Right.
Okay, but now the question is whether which properties are Lewis's perfectly natural properties are among those things that the laws can fail to disclose. And on Lewis's account of perfectly natural properties, the laws can fail to disclose them. But that doesn't seem to be a failure in the theory in any way. Whereas in the examples you're giving, there really are problems with the theories. At least that's what the mismatch problem is.
Yeah, I don't see that. I mean, but maybe we should just come back to this because I will sort of autocratically use my arbitrary decision about when Q&A period now needs to be, that distinction now needs to be respected. I mean, for now, I think it would, like granted that there's going to be more to say. I just want to like see if it's clear what the dialectical strategy is. To say, look, the skeptical scenarios that we're supposed to put pressure on Humean because like, why should we think that our physics discloses perfectly natural properties? Now get redescribed as skeptical scenarios that everybody should, going into this project, have granted are ones that we can't rule and shouldn't want to rule out a priori. Okay. All right. So this is all by way of saying, like, I think, I think there's like Lewis has more resources to respond to this worry than maybe have been appreciated. Okay, so let me like Yeah, David.
Just make sure I understood the first response. It sounded like, it sounded as if you were saying, one thing that we know for sure is that it's a perfectly natural property of a point in space, whether or not it's occupied by particles.
Oh, I was not saying that.
Oh, okay, so then I didn't understand the structure.
I mean,
of
it was more that, that it, that I don't know, like how much you want to lean on no for sure, right? But that, maybe it would be enough to say this, that, very, very like basic empirical evidence should inform us that at the level of microphysics, there's some distinction in the pattern of instantiation of perfectly natural properties in very small parts of space at different times of the sort needed to ground the evident distinction between where things are located right now.
Sure, I mean, that might not even, but you want it, I take it, make this expansive enough to include theories where space-time isn't even
Yeah.
fundamental. Certainly,
Yeah.
particles may not be.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, that the theory has to eventually be able to distinguish between a chair being here
Right.
and a chair being there.
Right.
Sure, that's an empirical, that's an obvious.
Yeah.
Empirical constraint, but it sounded as if part of the strategy for this response was something like, give me a break. We know that these must be perfectly natural properties. And I didn't know how you were. putting your
Okay,
finger
no,
on
I
it.
did not mean to say that. I should be a little bit more careful.
Okay,
Let's just say that when so the mismatch problem, the way to motivate is to sort of exhibit skeptical scenarios. And all I wanted to do there was draw a distinction between two kinds of skeptical
I
scenarios.
see, okay.
Like skeptical scenarios in which our theory is right about those perfectly natural properties and relations that most directly matter to configuration of things over
Right,
time,
right.
and those where it doesn't.
Right,
Now, I didn't say much about the second kind of like skeptical scenario because I'm not like, I'm not sure about this, but I suspect if you tried to spell it out, we would have the reaction like, yeah, okay, all you're pointing out is that the micro world could be completely unlike what we think it is, and yet through some conspiratorial process
Right.
give rise to these phenomena.
right.
Yeah, duh, right? That was my suspicion about that, like, kind of skeptical scenario. So in a way, I was just setting it aside.
Okay.
I wasn't explicit about that though. And focusing just on the ones where, no, the physics gets right, the stuff needed to ground facts about configuration over time, but it gets everything else wrong. And then noting that there are these two ways of responding to that challenge. Is that, yeah, okay. Okay, so Quine's,
Are
Oh, yeah.
you, can I ask?
yeah, of course.
So. I'm trying to understand the structure of the thought here. So in the skeptical scenarios you were describing, I was thinking there are some non-nomic propositions that the physicists are getting wrong. So there are facts like the chance that the particle is gonna do this that are true in this world, but the physicist theory will imply that that's a false proposition. In the mismatch problem, I'm not thinking
Yeah,
the problem is that there are non-nomic propositions
Yeah.
that physicists get wrong. This is kind of related to the TED thing, that like, what's important is not just truth or falsity, what's important is expressed in the right way or something like that.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what you would say
Okay.
that way of trying to
Okay.
clean apart these two.
Okay, I think the way I'm understanding the skeptical scenarios through a Lewisian lens, physicists will get right things like this. When we do this experiment, this is what we will observe. They will systematically get wrong things like this. Were we to do this experiment, this is what we would observe, but we're not actually going to do it. We'll systematically get that wrong, right? Because take the case where the distribution of perfectly natural properties is such that the best system is like massively non-deterministic. Then for all those counterfactuals that at least that have like specific enough antecedents, the right thing to say is like, were we to bring about those conditions? We're not going to, but were we to, lots of different things might happen, and there's nothing to even tell you which one would be more likely than which other one. But in doing physics, we routinely say things much stronger than that. And so, in fact, I mean, it's not just that there's the kind of epistemic failure that Ted drew attention to, but there's actually failure to get certain range of facts right. Interestingly, by the construction of the case, none of them will be facts, as it were, about what will happen or what did happen, right?
Right.
But that's okay. Like when you do physics, you don't just care about forecasting. Like in physics and in all sciences and in everyday life, when we predict, we predict counterfactually all the time, and we think it's important to get those predictions right. Yeah.
Like, so yeah, the reason they're symmetric or similar is because they're nomic or nomic-like.
Yeah.
Fact by counterfactual,
Mhm.
whatever, that they're both sort of giving up.
Yeah.
That we're giving up.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's talk quickly about Quine. I mean, in a way, I could sort of just point to things that Barry said yesterday, because I don't have a whole lot to add about Quine's own official approach to natural properties as it appears in the paper Natural Kinds. I think the key thing to emphasize that might be a slight difference in emphasis from the way Barry was describing Quine yesterday is that Quine is very clear in that paper that first, he's just focusing on two notions, the notion of kind and the notion of similarity. Reasons I'll get to, I think he should have cast his net a bit more widely. And he's interested in the question, like, how are these notions deployed in empirical inquiry? And what is their deployment, their evolving deployment look like as we get better and better and better at empirical inquiry and develop better and better and more sophisticated theories? And the overall picture is like, well, we find ourselves endowed with certain strategies for investigating the world and a certain conceptual toolkit. And it is part of this kind of like endowment. We find ourselves to work with notions of kind and similarity. There's a lot of rhetoric in the paper about how disreputable these notions are and about how they involve a kind of rot. He uses the word rot. This is what I meant by like swimming upstream against a tide of like rhetoric that does not particularly enhance your understanding. He doesn't say why they're disreputable, like what the standards are for being disreputable, at least with any clarity, but never mind. The overall picture is that as empirical inquiry becomes more sophisticated and as we develop more and like better and better theories leading up to things like chemistry and physics, we refine these notions into non-existence. Like we refine them in ways that ultimately allow us to jettison them entirely. Now, and so he says, like at the last paragraph of the paper, it's on the handout, in general, we can take it as a very special mark of the maturity of a branch of science that it no longer needs an irreducible notion of similarity and kind. It'll have a taxonomies, and it'll involve descriptive apparatus. But the taxonomies and the descriptive apparatus do not themselves need to be understood by reference to the notions of kind or the notion of similarity. It is that final stage where the animal vestige is wholly absorbed into the theory. In this career of the similarity notion, starting in its innate phase, developing over the years in the light of accumulated experience, passing then from the intuitive phase into theoretical similarity, and finally disappearing altogether, we have a paradigm of the evolution of unreason into science. Okay. I'm just gonna make one quick note about this and then like go back through and say where I think Quine's own particular approach had certain blinkers on it that I don't see why they're there. When I first read this, I thought, well, wait a minute, are you really getting rid of the notion of similarity? Don't we think don't we say things and intend them as substantive claims that I don't know, two electrons are exactly intrinsically alike? Yeah, I mean, or at least have exact. No, I'll just leave it that way. Are sort of duplicates of each other, and so I thought, like, like on my first read, maybe Quine is missing something. It's not that this notion of similarity has been gotten rid of; it's been refined, but it's still there as witness our endorsement of judgments like that. But I think that's a misreading. I think he thinks like, no, like I don't know. I think the proper like response on his behalf would be, I don't know what you're adding by saying they're exactly intrinsically alike, as if that's an extra substantive claim. we know how these like categories work within the theory. And we know that like within the theory says that in certain senses, like two electrons are substitutable like for each other in a certain way. So to just put a label on it, there's a kind of like a role for predicates like is an electron or has such and such negative charge that's distinctive within the theory that you are adding a kind of like philosophical gloss on, but I don't need the philosophical gloss to appreciate like what these categories are doing within the theory. I think that's the right way to think about Quine's approach. So it really is like for him, something like, well, we have this physical theory. There's a substantive question whether, say, two electrons are perfect duplicates of each other. We think they are. If the theory is right, then they are, but that's a substantive claim. I think he would not think that that's a substantive claim. There might be a substantive claim in the vicinity, namely someone who speculates that maybe electrons are not all perfect duplicates of each other might be understood as suggesting that there will be further refinements of this theory that will improve upon it by our, at least relative to the best standards that we are equipped to apply to judging improvement of theories on each other, that will introduce distinctions between electrons where we currently have none. Quine could make sense of that notion. And if that's all you mean by saying like, well, it might turn out that two electrons are not perfect duplicates, that's fine, right? But what would be incoherent, I think, on his view, would be this kind of speculation. Look, no. It might be that like the very best, like we really do have the very best theory, and yet unbeknownst to us, like electrons really come in like metaphysically speaking, fundamentally different kinds. Like no two electrons are perfect duplicates of each other. It just turns out that that fact makes no difference to the way they behave, or at least behave with respect to the phenomenon we're studying. I think on a Quinean view, that's going to be incoherent. If you were willing to talk about properties and not just predicates, you could it would be helpful to imagine Quine star who's willing to talk about properties, but properties in the abundant sense that Lewis has in contrasts natural properties with. Quine could say like, well, look, if all you mean that is that, like take any two electrons, there's sets one belongs to that the other doesn't. Well, obviously. And if you mean like facts about those membership are not going to be useful to latch onto for purposes of better theorizing, obviously. So there's a way of understanding this claim that like it could be that like our theory is great, cannot be improved on, and yet every electron is different from every other electron. There's a way of understanding that where it's trivially true, right? But absent that understanding, I don't think there's a way of understanding that as a substantive claim, unless it's really is the claim. Look, I'm making a bet that further refinements of our theory are possible, that by our lights for judging the relative merits of theories would issue an improvement and would require drawing distinctions where we currently have none. Okay. So there really is like a pretty profoundly profound difference in orientation towards things like fundamental property here in Quine than you see in Lewis. And I guess that was sort of
That's my point.
yeah. So what Barry said, in other words. But at the same time, I think, this picture that we have this endowment, we find ourselves with this endowment, call it our overall package for kind of, confronting the world as empirical inquirers. And the endowment consists in part in dispositions to respond to evidence in certain ways and part in a certain conceptual repertoire. So there's this kind of very sort of big picture like approach Quine's taking where like what we do in science and maybe in worthwhile philosophical reflection on science is try to figure out ways to refine and improve upon that endowment. That's an attractive picture, but I think it's helpful to be clear about what the endowment contains and doesn't contain. And here Quine seems to have some odd blinkers. And when we get to 3 sub B sub 4, Barry's going to start to get mad because I'm going to suggest that like one blinker is the Humeanism in Quine. But to start with the stuff that's not going to make Barry as mad because it's his conference and we don't want him to get too mad. A little bit mad. It's good, not too mad.
That's the whole point, is to make me mad, actually.
Oh, Oh, well, now you tell me. All right. So one thing is like the basic like conceptual toolkit Quine spots us, like that involves notions of kind and similarity, seems like oddly restricted. We also have, we actually do operate even in our, like untutored state with the notion of similarity in respect of X. No, for various different values of X. And it's curious in the paper that that's not, he doesn't sort of trot that out. It's like, maybe that should be our starting point of analysis. Like he quickly moves from like, well, look, we don't want a bare notion of X is similar to Y. We want a comparative notion. But really, if you want to understand how we use similarity, even in ordinary life, we use like X is more similar to Y in respect alpha. That seems to be the basic notion. What, like in the best case, the respects are something like structured determinables, like X is more similar to Y than it is to Z in a respective color or in respective, say, of location. No. And I think it's important to like focus on like if you're trying to do this reconstructive project of saying like, how did we get to mature science? How can I sort of see that as a refinement of something else that we start with? It's important to realize like what you start with is like a stock of determinables, like with some kind of structure on them that you use to characterize the world. And I think it's like non-trivial that the determinals include spatial and temporal ones, where from very early on in the history of science, we impose a very precise mathematical structure on them. Like going back to Euclid, I take it that Euclid thought of himself as laying out principles for to describe the character of space. No, like nowadays in mathematics, we think like, no, geometry has like preceded from that, and we have a more abstract characterization, but that wouldn't have been Euclid. Euclid would have said, I'm like laying out postulates that describe space itself. So this isn't meant to be some deep criticism. It's just that if you want to do this reconstructive process right, you should think like, well, we already start out with some highly mathematized like ways that, like our conceptual toolkit includes determinables that have a highly mathematically precise structure. Turns out on further investigation, we got that mathematical structure wrong. But it seems important to understand how the reconstruction succeeded to see that it started with something that already was pretty mathematically rich. I think a more serious problem with Quine's approach is that he seems to have a very narrow understanding of what the aims of empirical inquiry are, like what it is we're trying to get better at. He's not super clear in this paper, but various things he suggests, make it seem like he thinks like, well, the central aim is to get better at predicting. Okay. But furthermore, predicting just in the sense of forecasting. Like just in the sense of like, I have some data about the world and I want to have successful amplitude inferences to other facts about what the world is in fact like, right? That is not all we do in the sciences or in the everyday empirical inquiry we conduct all the time in order to get around in the world. When we can predict things like, I think it will rain. We can also, make predictions like, I think that if I were to do this, this would happen. Whereas if I were to do this, that would happen. So I'll do this and not that. And it's important in that kind of reasoning that I get both sides of that right. So there's a kind of narrow understanding of, or at least it seems to me, I'm not sure about the textual evidence about what prediction is. He talks a lot about induction too, and sort of fails to notice something that I take to be a kind of, like something that's, to the extent that we establish anything in philosophy has been established in philosophy of science, that even in cases where it looks like we're just doing straight induction, like you're sampling marbles from an urn with replacement, there are causal assumptions in the background of the kind of empirical reasoning we do there. Something like this has got to be right even for the way we forecast, because we use evidence derived from observation to make conclusions about what the world is like in respects that have not, are not, and will never be observed. And presumably one thing that lies behind that pattern of inference is some kind of like nascent assumption that can be revised when needed, that the way things are behaving when I'm looking is the same as when it would have been if I hadn't been looking. note the counterfactual element. So even in sort of like projecting beyond circumstances that we in fact witness, we or other humans in fact witness, it seems like we're up to our ears in background causal assumptions or assumptions about like the dependency structure of the world. So I think, like, put it this way, if you're going to do the Quine project right, you really want to canvass very carefully what is part of the, as it were, the endowment that we find ourselves with. Not just like what concepts it contains, but what aims are implicit in it, like in this, our attempts to make good empirical sense of the world. And so right now I've been just leaning on that as a point about prediction, but look, there's an additional aim, obviously closely connected to the aim of prediction, which is understanding the world as well, explaining why things behave the way they do. I didn't go back and double check, but I'm not sure that the word explanation, at least in the context that would signal that it's an aim of inquiry, shows up in natural kinds. Sanders, like,
It doesn't show up.
okay,
It's purely prediction.
yeah, okay. So that also seems to be a weird narrowing, a weirdly narrow view of the aims of scientific inquiry, which we ought to abandon. And now comes now's where we get to make Barry mad. Look, I don't understand, like, if you thought that what we philosophers of science should be doing in engaging in philosophical reflection on the practice of science is kind of either charting refinements that have happened and trying to reconstruct them in a kind of very lucid and illuminating way, or maybe even proposing further refinements on our overall sort of like toolkit for empirically investigating the world. And he thought, like, part of what that involves is taking kind of concepts that are serviceable but somewhat crude, like the concept of similarity or the concept of kind, and showing how they can be refined. Well, one of the concepts we start with are just concepts of dependence, between things. As when I say, like, oh, the cup is there. No. And I say, like, the cup would still, would still have been there if I had not been looking. No, or if no one had been looking. And the reason I highlight this is that it's at least not obvious. Well, sorry, let me back up. When you consider like everyday concepts of causal dependence, as someone who tries to work on, is like once had the ambition of giving like the one true analysis of X as a cause of Y, I can tell you that the structure of our ordinary causal concepts is really, really messy. It's ripe for refinement in various ways. And offhand, there are like two very different ways a refinement could go. One could be a refinement in a way that ultimately shows that we dispense with notions of dependence, or we analyze them out in non-modal terms. And that is like part of the Humean project, is to do that. And maybe that will work, maybe not. What's at least unclear at the beginning is why this project of refining concepts ought to lead in that direction. Like, why a priori we should say, like, oh yeah, it's, for that part of our conceptual scheme, it's a really good idea, as it were, to refine it away. I mean, we don't do that with our ordinary concepts of space and time, for example. Why would we do that with our ordinary concepts of causation? Well, maybe there's a good reason, but you'd like a sort of like robust defense of that reason. Hume himself had certain reasons, because he thought, like, we literally didn't know what we were talking about if we talk about like causation in anything but this like deflated manner. And sometimes, like, I'm just trying to provoke Barry because he's looking tired. But sometimes when you talk to Barry, he'll sort of like, when you catch him in an unguarded moment, his Humean commitments come out and he says, like, Tim's views about laws, I think they're unintelligible. And then other times when he's being more careful, it's like, no, it's just me. I don't understand them. But you always sort of think with Barry, there's like, when he's saying he doesn't understand them, he means like, and it's not my fault. No, it's Tim's fault, right? So like maybe you have some like philosophical reasons for thinking that there's something, to use Quinean language, disreputable about our ordinary causal notions that ought to pressure you to define them away in non-modal terms. But if what we're adopting is this kind of naturalist perspective, where it's not the job of a philosopher to adopt some transcendent standpoint on the practice, that seems like an odd thing to do. Why not just like take them at face value and see where refinement leads? In which case, it's quite possible that refinement will lead in a direction towards something like Tim's views about laws, or sort of views about laws that say, look, one of the basic aspects of reality is a kind of like space of physical possibility that the actual world sits in. No, that is not to be like, where that invocation of possibility is not to be explained away in terms of anything else, and certainly not to be explained away in terms of mere logical compatibility with certain de facto truths about our world. Yeah, the way Humean will take it. So I think like by Quine's own lights, there are these sort of interesting questions that arise about why he pursued the project the way he did. So I've already sort of indicated like what it, well, let me be somewhat like quick on, this is now on 3C, about what an augmented Quinean approach might look like. That is an approach to understanding and perhaps contributing to the refinement of our sort of overall toolkit for dealing with the world as in a scientific manner. I think the refinements are going to be of our sort of beginning endowment are going to be coordinated refinements to not just to ordinary notions of kind and similarity, but also to ordinary notions of like natural possibility, of what can and can't happen, of what would have happened under certain various circumstances and what might have happened. And I think it's plausible that, you could tell a story about a refinement that leads to a physics of the kind we have with a rich stock of mathematically structured determinables, but where importantly, the determinables that get introduced have within the physical theory direct ties to the two most important determinables or classes of determinables we start with, which are spatial and temporal ones. I think I'm not going to have time to like go into why I say this, but I think that on this way of thinking, especially if you think that part of what we want to do is refine without analyzing away ordinary modal notions, like everyday physically modal notions, I think it's unsurprising that that physics would evolve in a way where a great deal of importance is placed on the distinction between dynamics and initial conditions. No. So to go back to Lewis for a second, one thing that has bothered me for a long time about Lewis's official story about the way in which laws are supposed to systematize is that he draws no distinction between kinds of information about the world. That is, the official doctrine is a best system earns its status as such because of the way it optimally balances simplicity with informativeness about what the world is like, informativeness that is to be measured somehow by how narrowly it constrains the space of possible worlds compatible with it. But that second criterion places no emphasis whatsoever, like, or draws no distinction between information about dynamics and information about initial conditions. And unsurprisingly, Lewis's like story gets into trouble for that, because you can think like, well, a best system might massively increase informativeness if it says something really precise about boundary conditions at some point. And then you can ask about like, well, what would that cost in terms of simplicity? But the reaction is just like, that's the wrong kind of informativeness. What we actually want from our theories is, I think, uninformativeness with respect to possible initial conditions, and as much as possible informativeness with respect to dynamics. And that's unsurprising if you think about our explanatory ambitions and our interest in kind of having a systematic understanding of like the modal structure of the world. Because like the more uninformative the theory is about initial conditions, the more capacity it has to explain, at least if explanation is a matter of showing what depends on what, a very, very wide range of phenomena. The more informative it is about dynamics, the more powerful those explanations will be. That's the core thought. And for the same reason, I think it's unsurprising that you see in physics what I think of as like a broadly combinatorial approach to specifying the range of possible initial conditions. Okay, just in interest of time, I'm going to skip the comparisons thing. I think we can talk about that later, and some of it has already come up. And go back to like zoom out for a minute and try to understand this sort of Neurath's boat metaphor. So I said it a little bit ago that I thought it was a puzzling feature of Quine's approach that he apparently bakes in a Humean attitude towards physical modalities. And that if you were kind of just taking at face value, the endowment we have that is bequeathed to us by nature and history, that consists in part in a certain range of concepts that we use to sort of organize our theories about the world. it's not clear why you would have a kind of, the kind of relentlessly hostile attitude towards the modal concepts that Humeans have. I'm putting that in a provocative way, just because there is infamously being any. And it seems like that looks like Quine himself trying to adopt a kind of transcendent viewpoint from which he can say like certain ways of filling out the empirical scientific toolkit, especially the conceptual part of it, are to be ruled out from the get-go. And so like this is a good point to return to that metaphor of Neurath mode and try to do a little bit more than just use this impressionistic language of an Archimedean standpoint or a transcendent standpoint. And I found, I'm not sure about this, but well, to begin with, I think that there's a way of understanding the Neurath mode metaphor which is not helpful at all, which is like, no, you got to start with what you have. Well, duh. Right? Okay, of course. Right. And then like but the Buddhists wouldn't disagree with that at all. Right. So what is the way of understanding it that sees the metaphors actually imposing an interesting restriction on kinds of philosophical theorizing? I think that there's one way of understanding it. This is going out on a limb a bit that we can bring into focus if we do a detour through Hume on induction and understand the upshot of Hume's problem of induction properly. Maybe not in the way that Hume himself understood it. Very often the problem of induction is phrased as a problem for justifying inductive practices, and then one notices that, like, if you try to justify them by their track record, that looks circular. And now a whole debate launches like, well, is that a vicious kind of circularity, or are you misunderstanding what the project of justification should be? Like, it's not reasonable to set a standard where justifying induction means convincing the skeptic by a non-question begging argument, blah, blah, blah. Okay. I think there's another way of like appreciating Hume's insight though. Suppose we begin with something that's taken as a premise in standard ways of setting up the problem of induction, that, with appropriate hedges to deal with Kripkean meter sticks and so on, we do not and cannot have a priori knowledge of substantive truths about what the world is like. Right, let's suppose, or a priori justified belief about substantive truths about what the world is like. Suppose you now add, and this is going to be the crucial premise that in my view is the premise properly targeted by the problem of induction. You add that the best normative standards for assessing what we ought to believe with what credence on the basis of what evidence, those normative standards, the content of those standards is a priori accessible to us, at least in principle. Somebody sufficiently smart, like us, and sufficiently smart and reflective could work out from the armchair, not what the world is like, of course, but rather what would be appropriate to believe on any given batch of evidence. Okay, I think you can argue from there. I'm just going to punt that argument off stage because I'm keeping track of the time. That you can get from that alone that such a person would have a priori justified belief in quite a large number of substantive claims about what the world is like. More or less, I mean, this is like a package of claims that collectively would more or less amount to the thesis that nature is uniform. So it's not just that, like if you want to put this back in the Humean lens, our inductive practices presuppose that nature is uniform in a way that would allow someone absent any empirical evidence to form the justified, assuming those inductive practices are in good working order. It would allow someone a priori, assuming this thesis that the normative standards themselves are a priori accessible to us, to work out a priori, but defeasibly to be sure, but a priori that nature is uniform. Okay, so if you think that's bonkers because you're committed to this view that what we can work out about the world a priori is quite limited, then you ought to say, well, then one of the things that we can't work out a priori is what the best ways, normatively best ways of responding to evidence are. We have to discover that. That's a somewhat unsettling thought, by the way, I think. But I think it's an interesting thought. And it fits some of what Hume says when he talks about empirical inference or inference concerning matters of fact being founded on a kind of custom or habit. You just have to discover what kinds of beliefs that that natural instinct warrants you in drawing. He doesn't exactly use the word warrant, but you know, it's clear from things he says that he thinks there are better and worse ways to do this. So it's not like, you know, normative epistemology goes out the window on this view. So if that's your background view, that we find ourselves with, you know, like responding to evidence in various ways, and that we couldn't have anticipated a priori. And furthermore, we think, at least internally, like from an internalist sort of imminent perspective, like there are ways of responding to evidence allow us to sort of, you know, reflect on those various ways and distinguish better and worse episodes of response. Like on this occasion, I really overreacted that piece of evidence and got things wrong. On this occasion, I didn't. Then it looks like the project of refinement is in part going to be an empirical project. Like we're going to try stuff out in the spirit of like, you know, experimentation to see what will work better. And so on this view, it's not that it doesn't make sense to think carefully about how to refine our techniques, drawing on our knowledge of what's worked before. But it doesn't make sense to engage in, this is like, we're now at 5B3. It doesn't make sense to engage in speculations that fall outside math and logic, B, fail to be empirically regulated, and 3, and this is the crucial thing, cannot, from our current perspective, plausibly be seen as helping to further refine our techniques for empirical investigation. And that, I think, I think if you're going to challenge Lewis from a Quinean perspective, that's the way you should do it. You should say something like, look, you can introduce these categories of perfectly natural property if you want, that's fine. But for us to take them seriously, you need to make a case that in so doing, you are engaged in a project that could plausibly be seen as improving upon our empirical techniques for encountering the world. And look, that it's not open and shut. Like the answer is no, you're not, right? From this very perspective, you can't settle a priori that a certain proposed improvement won't work. But that doesn't mean you can't sort of weigh in on it in some like reasoned fashion. So by very rough ideas, like if we want to see Quine as a threat to Lewis, it should be by way of this understanding of what it is to be a naturalist, to take a natural approach in your epistemology. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Okay, we have almost 15 minutes for questions, so put your hand up and keep it up if you want to ask a question. Can you start? Yes, please, and then put your hands up.
I just want to ask a question you probably haven't talked about. So from like a Van Fasten point of view, and someone would say like, what if like a future best theory or something like basically like a set of mathematical axiom plus a blah blah blah, and there's no kinds of information that can be written in like a canonical language that can tell anything interesting about how like the structure of the world is like. So something like particles and time, space, and causality, everything's like an emergent phenomena. In that sense, how do we even make sense of this like natural property? Like everything is just like mathematical language that we don't really like. It probably does not have the same explanatory power as other rival theory, but if this new theory have a better prediction to provide, can align with empirical evidence better, we would think that this later theory are more correct than the other one, right? So how do we make sense of the natural property in our best theory that cannot tell anything interesting about the structure in that sense?
So are you imagining a theory where there's nothing in the theory that you could even plausibly take to be trying to pick out a natural property?
Yes.
But it's massively successful.
Yes.
I think that if you're Quinean, you should be open to that, and you should think like, look, there was nothing certainly nothing a priori inevitable about the development of physics into the form it's taken. And if anything, speculations like Lewis, you might have a sort of error theory for why Lewis is thinking he's doing like, you know, armchair metaphysics here, which is he's been rightly impressed by the form that physics in fact has taken, but has misunderstood that success by thinking that, well, that must reflect some sort of deep, in fact, I think sort of metaphysically necessary truth about the world, namely that it's populated by natural properties and relations. But but I think if you're a Quinean, you should be, you should think like, look, there's no point in trying to legislate a priori that a future successful theory can't take the form you're describing, Clara. And if so, we will discover that thinking of the world in terms of like fundamental physical properties and kinds is turns out at the end of the day not to be as non-negotiably valuable as we thought. I think that would be the view. If I've understood the question right.
Yeah, so just, I'm slightly puzzled by why this is historical.
Mm.
I'm slightly puzzled by why you're puzzled about why Quine is a Cuban. I mean, it's 1969. That's,
Oh,
Like-
yeah, fair.
so,
Yeah,
I mean,
Yeah.
fine, you could,
yeah,
right, so philosophically, right, of course, you can take certain bits that Quine has signed up to and marry them with a much more chilled out view of
Yeah.
accusation, right? But nobody apart from Stone Age knew what to do with counterfactuals. Everybody thought causation was completely weird, and they thought that Russell was right, that science has no need for it. So that's fine, yeah.
Yeah, I-
Lovely, right? I mean, it's
I-
contemporary Quine could have jettisoned
Fair,
that, but I.
fair, fair. I think maybe the way to put it, Helen, would be not, it's not that I'm puzzled, like, look, it was staring him in the face. What the hell is wrong with him? But more, if you understand the philosophical motivation, then you can see his like pursuit of this project as being weird, like improperly constrained by certain, like, what in hindsight we can see as like unreasonable restrictions that the culture he was in was imposing on him. I mean, same thing, like he doesn't mention like structured magnitudes either. And I've wondered, I mean, this would be something for like maybe Sander to like respond to. But I've wondered if part of the reason is like there's, he was the Kool-Aid he was drinking was like the tasty first order logic Kool-Aid, right? Where you think like the ideal language should be a language whose basic descriptive vocabulary, non-logical vocabulary, just has this very simple structure. Whereas if you're, if all of his like the people who's interacting with had all been like trained up like in mathematical physics and was thinking like that's the best mathematical physics gives us a kind of paradigm for how to describe reality, then things would have looked differently. No, but fair point.
Yeah, so just, not weird, possibly improper, but not weird.
Yes.
My question is about Quine's idea that we're going to get rid of similarity in kind.
Mhm.
And the answer to my question might be just Quine 101,
Mhm.
because I think there are more kinds than most scientists and philosophers of science would countenance. So when he talks about getting rid of similarity in kind, what does that do to law? What does that do to laws of physics? What does that do to even prediction if you get rid of similarity in kind? So the question, I guess you could put the question in this way: does he put any kind of restriction on what he's talking about in terms of getting rid of similarity in kind?
I mean, he doesn't say a lot in the paper about what he means by having gotten rid of them. I think that one thing we could say on his behalf is that in a mature scientific theory like theories of physics, you have a descriptive apparatus that has enough of the right kind of rich structure that everything you might have wanted to do predictively and explanatorily with the notion of similarity, at least, you can now do in other terms, right? So instead of saying like, well, when we want to explain why the window broke, it's not that Susie threw the rock in just that way, because other similar ways she could have thrown it would have led to the window breaking. This is like the kind of thing you might say in order to draw attention to what's really doing the explanatory work. We could now say, well, look, in principle, we could redescribe the events with certain parameters or magnitudes and say like over a certain range of variation of those parameters, the window still would have broken. So that's just like a quick example where a notion of similarity might be used in a kind of explanatory context, but dispensed with once we have a sufficiently sophisticated scientific theory to apply to the phenomenon in question. And not dispensed with because the notion of similarity wasn't getting at something useful to get at, but because we can now get at it by helping ourselves to a descriptive apparatus that involves like magnitudes with mathematical structure, where we can say things like, instead of talking about a throw of a similar rock, we can talk about a throw of a rock whose mass is, numerically close to the actual mass. Does that make sense? So I think in like, my guess is that on a Quinean approach, at least as augmented, where you think like part of the aim is to have of inquiry is to explain and predict counterfactually and not just predict in the forecasting sense, that what he ought to say is that whatever use the notions of similarity and kind have can now be subsumed by other aspects of the descriptive apparatus that our physics gives us. Is that?
I understand that, but I just don't know how you could have laws or predictions if you give up similarity and kind altogether.
Well, because you've got ways of describing the phenomena that you want to predict that don't require those notions. I mean, that's the sort of flat-footed response.
Okay.
Yeah, but maybe there's probably more to say.
Juan, on the Zoom?
Yeah, hi, Ned.
Hey,
Thank you.
Juan.
So my question is about the skeptical interpretation of the matching problem, but let me just say one little thing about something you said at the end, which the idea that we have to figure out empirically what our fundamental epistemic principles are, you said was unsettling. I think it's more than unsettling, it's of dubious coherence, but that was you talking about Quine. But so on the skeptical interpretation of the matching problem, so the more radical skeptical scenario, you said the right response to that is duh, but I was wondering if this is what you had in mind. So it's strictly parallel to the ordinary skeptical scenario, brain nevad, whatever. And one mainstream response there is it's a possibility, but we're justified in thinking, a priori, by the way, we're justified in thinking that it doesn't obtain. And if everything goes right, we know that it doesn't obtain. So I was wondering if that's what you meant by the duh, that yeah, that's the radical skeptical scenario about structure is possible, but we're justified in thinking that we got it right. And if everything goes right, we know that we got it right.
Yeah, so I should have been a bit more careful. I meant to be like bracketing the question of whether and why we're justified in dismissing certain skeptical scenarios. What I really wanted to do at that point in the talk was emphasize that on, when you understand Lewis's proposal by its own rights, there aren't novel skeptical scenarios here. There's skeptical scenarios of a familiar kind. And one familiar kind is, it's not exactly the brain of that. It's a, like, take a skeptical scenario that was considered like a live option at the turn of the century, not the last turn, but the one before, which is that the atomic hypothesis is just a useful fiction. Now, for all we know, it's kind of like some weird like goo down at the microphysical level. That's the kind of skeptical scenario I had in mind. Like, we've got all this evidence here for what the microphysical world is like, as it were, in its geometrical respects, if you like. In respect of the kind of geometrical structure picked out by the local guillables, if you're thinking in Bell's terms. But that could be totally wrong, and as a matter of pure logic, sure, one can even with some creativity imagine like trying to describe a story according to which it's like goo down there, and yet all the phenomena that lead us to think that there are sort of relatively discrete atoms come out the way they do. That was the kind of skeptical scenario I had in mind. And I didn't have a view about like why we're licensed in discussing it, or at least I wasn't stating one. I think in that case, it's probably different from the story about dismissing brain nevat. I think it's going to be something much more empirical. So it's striking that on the goo hypothesis, it would be a remarkable coincidence if any of like a couple dozen quite experimentally distinct ways of measuring Avogadro's number gave the same result. In fact, on anything but the atomic hypothesis, that would be like a remarkable coincidence. But they do give the same result. And so there's a kind of empirical reasoning there that's like quite familiar. It's the same kind of reasoning that we use when if I have eyewitnesses to some event and I know that they couldn't have conspired, and they give the same detailed report, the evidential force of those two reports is much greater than as were the sum of the parts. So I think like it'll be different from, I'm assuming, I mean, you know better, but because you know how to refute the brain of that skeptic and I do not. But I'm assuming that like the reputation of that kind of skepticism is gonna have a different structure. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. But I was thinking about not the goose scenario, but the other one where your response was, yeah, we already knew that. And I was wondering if, in addition to already know, and yeah.
I think there were multiple points where I said duh.
Okay, right.
It's like a technical term. Yeah. And one was in like you could factor this, the skeptical scenarios or try to motivate the mismatch problem into two kinds. One is like, we could be getting the part of our theory that describes the sort of structure, microphysical structure needed to serve as a ground for just the macroscopic data about where things are at different times. So we get that wrong. And then there's a kind of skeptical scenario that says like, no, we get that right. We're right about like what the fact that there are particles say, and that they move around in certain characteristic ways, but we're wrong about the other properties they have. What I was trying to say about that other one is like, it also like lends itself to a duh response, because we should have known that ahead of time that like, yeah, physics could turn out, the laws of our world could turn out to be such that even though they are laws governing the behavior of point particles, the way they govern that behavior is massively different from what we think it is, but we get unlucky about the data that the world serves up.
So that's a scenario. So, but if the
Hold on
actual
a
scenario
second,
is not,
we should
yes,
stop, because we're out of time.
All right. Good, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thanks, everyone.